The Legend of the Broke-Down Palace. It was back in 80 or 82 when the Bighorn River was still a little-known treasure, and fly fishing was not nearly as fashionable as it is today. We were all young, ambitious, and devoid of any responsibility, fledgling capitalists with a common addiction to fishing. We had been up to Montana about 5 times in the last year, and knew there was no place better for catching big rainbows and rambunctious browns. I can't remember who the genius was that originally suggested we look into the real estate possibilities, but surely they had divine providence. It took a little time for the grapevine to work, but we finally got word. An elderly farmer had 2 acres of riverfront property, right at the 12-mile access with a rustic old farmhouse, and all for the unbelievable price of $15,000. The opportunity sounded too good to be true, so we decided to go have a look. At the appointed time, we headed from Fort Smith down to St. Xavier to see this deal of the century. The house was the perfect specimen of antique rustic beauty. The 2 acres of land turned out to be a low-lying pasture, right on the river, a fisherman's paradise. The fish were rising from every ripple, sparrows were diving and swooping, the wind rustled through a grove of huge old oak trees, and you could hear the constant cackle of pheasant. There was only one small problem, though. The rustic farmhouse was not situated on the 2 acres of riverfront pasture, and never had been. As it turned out, the old farmer lived in the rustic old farmhouse, and he wanted to level it to build himself a contemporary. He figured it would be cheaper to sell the house and have someone else pay to remove it. Our enthusiasm was undiminished by this minor obstacle, so we proceeded to research the engineering prospects of house moving. We discovered that the Hardin Excavation and Equipment Rental Corporation could provide us with the house relocation services we desired, and for an additional fee, could also provide a sound foundation on which to place the farmhouse once moved. Blinded by our love for fishing and that age-old desire to own our own private piece of paradise, the contracts were signed. The house was to be moved the following spring. We were all present on that fateful rainy spring day when the Hardin Excavation and Equipment Rental Corporation unceremoniously wrenched, pried, and dragged that poor old house down to the river and dropped it on the newly constructed Economy Foundation. The truck ride across the cow pasture was hard on our new 100-year-old structure, and the uprooted house didn't quite sit square on its new anchor. The brawny excavation crew departed, saying that they would return at an unspecified time in the future to complete the work. We were overjoyed at the sight of our quaint little house. Its majestic grandeur brought tears to our eyes. And we decided to call the place the Palace. We found an old muddy board to use in lieu of our missing steps, unpacked the car, and climbed into our new home. The first thing we noticed was that none of the doors or windows were exactly square, and the floor had an unnatural bow, giving the place an M.C. Escher look. Outside, it began raining buckets, pounding down like some feverish drum solo, and we were all in the mood to celebrate our real estate coup. We each selected a room to call our very own, and then we all congregated in the grand salon for some serious festivities. We sat on the floor around a flashlight and began dealing cards, drinking moonshine and telling stories, and occasionally running to find another pot to put under the dripping ceiling. We stuffed our faces with canned sardines, hard sausage, fried chicken, blue cheese, and potato chips. This went on most of the night, until the last of us slumped over, lulled into slumberland by the rain's nonstop crescendo. When we awoke sometime that next afternoon, the sun streamed through the windows and the sky was a clear blue, but our heads were still a bit foggy, so it was some time before anyone really took a long look out the window. I'm not sure who was the first to notice, but there was quite a clamor when we realized our rustic farm was no longer on our 2 acres of fisherman's paradise, but was now lazily drifting right down the middle of the Bighorn River. The heavy rain had caused the river to swell over its banks, and the old house, not yet properly attached to the foundation, had set sail. Nobody knew exactly where we were, but best estimates put us 4 or 5 miles downriver from our homestead, which meant it was probably another 17 or 18 miles to Hardin and the Two Leggins Bridge. Being the house was floating pretty well, we naturally decided to just let our house drift until Hardin. Once at the bridge, we'd dock the house, call the Hardin Excavation and Equipment Rental Corporation, and have them haul it back to where it belonged. It was pretty easy to keep the house going down the middle of the river by steering with one of the Mackenzie boat oars out the kitchen door. Making the best of the mishap, the rest of us set up our rods and started fishing from the windows. It was a bit hard to cast from inside the house, so we mostly nymphed. Using an upstairs-downstairs setup with Beach Creek up top and 18 Miracle below seemed to be most productive, and the fishing pretty good. Nevertheless, we did have our concerns. There was talk that we had long since floated past the Two Leggins Bridge and were now on our way to the Grand Canyon or some other geographically undesirable location. Then somebody hooked a big one. Not just a large bighorn trout, but a monster, the biggest rainbow we had ever seen. We took turns fighting that fish, passing the rod from one window to another, as the fish first swam upriver, then down, and circumnavigated the house several times. It was a real Chinese fire drill as we frantically scrambled to get the upper hand on that whopper. Disaster struck in the midst of the frenzied battle. In all the chaos, no one noticed the diversion dam until it was too late. There were sounds of creaking as the house dropped over the 4-foot waterfall and landed with a jarring crunch. Momentarily, we were wedged half over the spillway as water filled the living room and shouts of, "We're sinking." Luckily, the force of the water slowly turned the house and we finally plunged it back into the main current. Of course, the jolt left us all piled up in one corner, but we quickly got to our feet and sorted out our rods. To our surprise, we found we were still hooked into that big old trout. No one paid much attention to the flooded house. The trout was all that mattered now. We were in quite a pickle, floating downstream with the fish still above the diversion dam. To remedy the situation, we climbed onto the roof through a bedroom window, while someone passed the rod up from the palure, and the battle went on. We finally worked the fish over the waterfall, and fought it all the way down to the Two Leggins Bridge. We beached the house and landed that big old rainbow. As it turned out, that fish was the biggest ever caught in the recorded history of the Bighorn River. It weighed 13 pounds 8 ounces when it was mounted, and the trophy now proudly hangs on permanent display at Polly's Diner in Fort Smith. After the Hardin Excavation and Equipment Rental Corporation arrived, it was a curious sight to see that old farmhouse rocking and swaying as it sped back up the highway. When it finally was plunked back in its rightful place, the doors, windows, roof, and floors were even more twisted than before. Due to the incident, the house was renamed, of course, and that's the legend of the broke-down palace.